Control, this is Delta Squad. Any word from Alpha?
Negative, Delta. We still have radio silence. Over.
Roger that. Dom.
So I had recently stumbled on a blog post titled The Art of War, Gears of War, Knock Knock. Now what this blog post covers is Gears of War level design, and it references the design that's made throughout the game as an hourglass. This hourglass consists of combat bowls separated by a corridor, and this blog post and myself will be delving a little bit more into what this means. So this video is mainly a recreation of his findings, also sprinkled in with a little bit of tidbits that I found interesting. So starting off with an introduction, I'm going to paraphrase what he says, but simply, creating satisfying combat is not easy. There aren't very many games that do this very well, but if you're interested on how to make successful, engaging combat scenarios, Gears of War is an excellent place to look. So as referenced earlier, the hourglass structure is something that's seen throughout the entirety of Gears of War, and a lot of games have tried to emulate that in recent history. Essentially, what a combat bowl is just an arena where the player is locked in, facing against other enemies, and each combat bowl is separated by a corridor. And this corridor is used for progressing the narrative or giving the player some time to scavenge around and look for items. And in Gears of War, combat is not exclusive to these combat bowls. In fact, more often than not, you'll be engaging with enemies in these corridors. They just kind of help shape the flow and dictate the pacing of the game. So what is a combat bowl and what makes it different than fighting in a corridor? Basically, combat bowls are large, typically open areas, allowing the player to navigate freely and allowing the player to create more tactical options that are available to them in this larger space. Corridors are kind of a stark contrast. They're a little bit more constricting, but they still have a very important purpose. His blog has a top-down 2D view of the level, which is referenced here, and we'll be going back and looking at this in greater detail when the time comes. Taking our abstract hourglass look at Gears of War level design, we can see that same principle applies here, but in a clearer way. The red highlighted areas indicate the corridors that funnel the player. They're used to structure the narrative and let them cool off before and after battles. The green area is a combat bowl. These combat bowls are locked off arenas that funnel the player in very deliberate ways. We'll take a look at what this means here in a moment. They're much more open than corridors, so they promote a lot of lateral and rotational movement within them. So there you go, that's the difference between a combat bowl and a corridor and how the two relate and how they're used together. Let's take a look at a quick playthrough of this segment, see how everything fits. So the very opening of this area is blocked off. That means the player cannot turn around and go back to the previous area. This is a very common level design trope. Most level designers will do what we see here, where they close a door behind us, where they have the player drop down from a ledge that they can't climb back up. So we're in this hallway, there's only one way for us to go, and we have our squad mates walking ahead to entice us to move forward. There's some interesting framing going on here, and I really like this segment just by the way it looks and what this accomplishes. There's a lone light at the end of this hallway. There are some cool architectural tricks here as well. There's a lot of framing on the sides of the walls. They could have just left this blank, but they decided to add these steel kind of girders that help frame the scene as well as draw our eyes to where we're supposed to go. And this is actually really important for when we exit this, as the cramped scenery transitions to this open combat bowl. The contrast and tone of the bright building with the dark backdrop makes our eyes shift upwards. This allows us to really appreciate the scale of this building. It also gives us a clear objective and a landmark to familiarize ourselves with. Before the combat is actually initiated, there's a QuickTime event that the game throws at us to ensure that we see the Crimson Omen painted on this van. So without it being immediately obvious to the player, we're being funneled in a very clever way. The level designer also gave us enough room to explore and find this cog tag tucked away in the corner of the level. As the player progresses towards the plaza, he's greeted with various sandbags and roadblocks. This is all done in an environment where the player doesn't feel pressured. He's free to explore and acclimate himself with his surroundings. The shape of the walls and sandbags funnel the player to the secondary landmark, which is this fountain in the very center of the House of Sovereigns. Here's the landmark from another angle as we approach the House of Sovereigns. You can see the framing was very deliberate to ensure that the player saw this. So you can tell by now that this is the remastered version of Gears of War. Some of the lighting is different, and there have been some changes that I don't necessarily agree with. For instance, the doors in the back are very hard to see. In the vanilla version of Gears of War, it was very obvious that there were two doors that were closed, and the two center doors were open. When the level triggers take place in the vanilla version, it was very easy to tell where the enemies were coming from. But here, it's not quite so obvious. The lighting is much more dark. It's more natural, but it's still significantly darker. So here we go, now we have some combat. A new enemy was just thrown our way, and the territories have been established. There's a friendly territory and an enemy territory. The allied territory is littered with sandbags. It gives us ample cover to move between, and it gives us a chance to examine the battleground. The most obvious threat is a troika at the edge of the arena. This troika creates a boundary of the enemy territory. And if we can look at this in an abstract way, we'd see something kind of interesting. So the red border is obviously the enemy territory, and the troika is highlighted in yellow. So there are 2 safe zones for each side. There's a safe zone for the player territory, there's lots of sandbags, and the enemy territory has their spawns and a little bit of cover outside of this building. The space in between the friendly territory and the enemy territory creates this kill zone, or sort of a no man's land. And if you look at the level in this sort of way from a top-down view, it's almost reminiscent of World War I battles, where there were 2 safe zones, or trench systems, and a no man's land in between. So there's a very liberal use of sandbags allowing us to dart in between cover, and the game utilizes this opportunity to introduce us to a new enemy, the Grenadier. Obviously the troika to the left of us is way too powerful for us to take on, and if you whiff grenades like me, you'll be forced to move to the right, where you just dispatch that Grenadier. This opens up a flank route for us. We can get behind the enemy and flank that troika. The animation of the door opening, as well as that point of interest indicated by the game, in combination with an ally NPC advising us to take that route,
Get in there and flank that nest. We'll cover.
successfully entices us to get in there and flank that nest. Here is our transition to a corridor. So there is a lone grunt that moves from the left side to the right side of the screen. Just beyond him is an emergence hole that surfaces. The objective is to close it as quickly as possible with grenades, or else reinforcements will keep spawning in. Previously in the combat bowl, we were very free to move around. But now in this corridor, movement is much more restricted. We don't have as much cover, so we have to be clever and quick in dispatching this emergence hole. There's not a lot of cover, but there is a lot of variation in it. We have medium cover, we have destructible cover, and we have tall cover. The player can look around a pillar to aim, or he can fire over the top of a roadblock. Just limiting the amount of cover that the player has creates the sense of urgency. They have a timed objective. They know that they need to take care of this emergence hole as quickly as possible, but the limited amount of cover presents a greater challenge. Once that emergence hole is taken care of, the player moves on to take care of the troika, which my AI partners finished off. This troika marks the very end of this corridor. There's nowhere else for the player to go except for back outside. The player is then rewarded with a cutscene. I use that term in quotes because I don't necessarily agree with it. I think the cutscene here is to illustrate a resting period, to let the player know that they can take a break. It also creates a setting of revenge, as Carmine just took a sniper to the head. So we're back in the action, we immediately have an ammo box that we can exploit. Or if you're dog shit like me, you can fumble with your weapons for 20 seconds. This is my favorite thing that a level designer can do. You fight an uphill battle against encampments or turrets or whatever, and once you achieve victory, you're given a position of power where you can inflict damage back at your enemy. It's simple and it's incredibly satisfying. Gibbing Locust with a troika also makes it a lot better. This is not the only time Gears of War utilizes this either. Segments like this are almost a staple to Gears of War throughout its entire campaign. The territories have flip-flopped. The gameplay is no longer about progressing through an uphill battle. It's about stationary combat, holding a line, and the overall combat range has increased significantly thanks to the troika. Even though the same space is used, the new position of the player and their enemies brings some new meaning to the space. So after that satisfying battle, door number 4 opens up, and there's just a handful of locusts to take care of before the end of this segment. The combat range is brought in significantly thanks to this corridor. So now that we've gone through that whole thing, let's go ahead and do a nice little recap. We've talked about the hourglass shape, and what combat bowls and corridors mean for Gears of War. We've talked about conveying challenge through an uphill battle, fighting against a troika tucked off in a far corner of the map. The level designers used enemies as a way to mark progression and point the player in the right direction. We've seen the contrast between the combat bowls and the corridors. We saw a little bit of challenge, as an emergence hole acted as a timed objective. A short little cutscene gave us some breathing room and reason for revenge. This was heightened when we were given the troika, as helpless enemies charged at us to their death. This level was wrapped up with a few small enemies back in a corridor, transitioning us to a little bit of exposition to come. So there we have it. Knock Knock in Gears of War. This is easily one of my favorite levels in the game. It's short, but it's very powerful, and it's a lot of fun. If you like Gears of War, what are some of your favorite levels to play? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.